In order to grow your podcast, it's important that you understand the information that you're gathering in order to create goals, achieve those goals, surpass those goals, and create more ongoing goals for your show. Today, we're going to be talking about where to look for your podcast statistics, how to understand them, and ways to promote your podcast using those podcast stats. I am really excited about this episode because I love talking about statistics and understanding the background and the information that's available to us as podcasters in order to grow our podcast and make better decisions with our show. We have a podcast episode that we'll make sure we link in the description that talks about podcast stats, how to understand them, where to look for them, and all that. But I'll give you a rundown of that real quick. The number one place where you'll be able to find your podcast stats is using your podcast hosting platform. It's important that you are looking in there, I would say about every 3 months or so, to see how your podcast is growing, as well as if there's any major things that you can see that are obviously increasing your downloads or hindering your downloads. We had one client be able to double her downloads through a strategic podcast guesting. And so when we were looking at her stats, I said, whoa, what happened here? Your downloads doubled. What's going on? Were you on a podcast recently? And then she was able to go back and look at her calendar to see, oh yeah, I had that podcast episode go live on that date. So that was able to very easily see what was going on. Another client was wondering why her podcast stats had gone down. So when we looked at the information, we saw that she had switched her podcast from a Friday to a Monday around that time and honed in on the content that she was creating. Both of these things made an impact on her downloads. Now, that doesn't mean that these downloads going down was a bad thing. It just is information for us to take and see, where do we need to shift things? Do we want to shift them back? Or does this make sense to weed out the listeners that are not here for the content that you want to talk about moving forward? You might see something like this happen, especially if you go through a podcast rebrand. You might find that some of the people who are listening are no longer on board with what you want to talk about, and that's okay. It's up to you to decide. Are you going to keep going ahead on this, or are you going to take a step back and reevaluate? So looking at your podcast stats, it's important to see where those downloads are, but then to dive a little deeper on that, let's go ahead and look not just at the podcast stats, but also at the major podcast listening apps that your listeners are using. The top two that you'll probably see are going to be Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Both of those are the top performing podcast apps in the US as well as internationally. By looking at both of these places, you'll be able to see, okay, this is the percentage of listeners that are on this app, and then you can dive a little deeper on your listener demographics, how much of an episode they're actually listening to, and be able to make some decisions based on that. The reason that your podcast hosting platform is not going to have that information is for privacy and security. When someone signs up to have an account with a podcast listening app, they give that podcast listening app information based on them. They say, yes, you can take my information. This is who I am. This is my demographic. From there, your podcast hosting platform does not have access or the security protocol to pull that information. So you have to dive a little deeper if you want to know more about your audience. Once you get onto the back end of the Apple Podcast Manager or your Spotify Podcast Manager, both of these places, you'll be able to see more about how much of an episode your listeners are listening to. This is a stat that's going to be really important to be able to make a decision on if your episodes need to be shorter. Do you need to do more solo episodes or more guest episodes? What is it that your audience is interested in listening to? And if you see that your podcast completion rate is over 100%, that is not a glitch in the matrix. It is simply that your listeners went back and re-listened to that episode. So there is where you're going to find more about your downloads, more about how much of your episodes people are listening to, your listener demographics. So how can you use this information? The best way to use this information is, like I've described, to make better decisions for your podcast ongoing. It allows you to see what's working and what's not for your specific podcast and for your specific listeners. So often I see podcasters comparing their podcast to someone else's when there are no two podcasts that are exactly the same. They're not talking about the same exact content. The hosts are very different. Their mannerisms are very different. It doesn't matter if there's another podcast out there talking about podcasting. They're going to be different than this one. So it's important to use this information to help you make those better decisions. Next, we're going to talk about podcast charts. Now, everyone wants to rank on a podcast chart, but while that's good, it's important to go back to your goals. If your goal is to increase your listeners, maybe it's to make sales from your podcast, getting ranked on a chart does not equal sales. It's the content within the podcast that is going to lead to sales. So that is what you should be focusing on. So go back to your goals. If your goal is to get more engagement, then that means you're going to want your listeners to leave reviews. So where can you look for your ranking of your podcast? We like to use the platform Chartable. It's affordable and it is very easy to navigate, and it allows you to be able to see not just where you rank in your own country, but also in other countries. If you were to go to the Apple Podcast app on your phone and you live in the United States, you will only see reviews and ratings from people who are in the United States. But there are people who are maybe leaving reviews from Canada or other countries. So in order to be able to see those and capture those for some social proof, that is where you're going to want to go somewhere like Chartable. There are tons of other places to go. I'm not going to make this complicated though. Just go to Chartable and use that as a tool to easily navigate to see where you're ranking, as well as the countries that you're ranking and any international reviews and ratings that you might have received. You can also see where you rank globally using Listen Notes. Listen Notes will give you a listen score as well as a global ranking. Now that is based off of a certain number of podcasts that are all over the world. You can see where your competition ranks and where you rank based on the topic of your podcast. But also note that this is not based off of your category. This is simply based off of all the podcasts in the world, which, even though there are millions of podcasts, only thousands, tens of thousands of those podcasts are actively producing and creating content, which means for podcast listeners, they're going to be the ones that are going to be getting a lot of those downloads. So you're not really up against the millions, you're up against the tens of thousands. Now, what can we use those rankings for in promoting our podcast and getting more people to listen to it? It can create a bit of FOMO for people who see your podcast. So you can use the term globally ranked top 5% podcast. That allows you to show your potential listeners, those people on social media, hey, I'm doing something pretty incredible here, and I think that you should know about it. So that is something you can use. If you are ranking on charts, you can say internationally ranked in 10 countries, hitting top 10 charts in 5 countries. Any way you can spin it to encourage other people to say, hey, I haven't heard about this podcast, but other people are listening to it. I want to know more about this. So it allows you to potentially get new listeners. By using these charts and using these rankings, yes, they can be a bit of fluffy stats that might not actually give you valuable information on your audience, like those stats that we talked about at the beginning, but they do allow you to encourage people to come in and listen to your show. So even though they might be a bit arbitrary and it's actually quite easy to rank, most people don't know that, but it's really easy to rank your podcast. I think that it's really important that we still use this information to not only validate our podcast, but also validate ourselves. Podcasting can be such a lonely experience sometimes. And so when you have this information and you have this data to pull from, it allows you to see, hey, okay, this is not in vain. People are listening to me. People do care about what I have to say, and I can keep going. That is why most podcasters stop. It's usually one of two things. Either they have no idea what else to talk about, or they feel like their podcast isn't reaching people and it isn't creating the connection or the community or whatever it is that they set out to create with their show. So it's important that we're looking at this information, not just from an analytical standpoint, but also from a human standpoint of validation as well. These are all places that we look to when we are coming up with our podcast clients' end of year reports. It helps us be able to showcase, here's how you did overall in the year. It also allows our clients to potentially use this information to secure sponsors for their show. So if getting sponsors is something that you're interested in, we have, I want to say about 2 or 3 episodes in our backlog that you can listen to. We'll make sure that we link them in the show notes, where you can learn more about how to get sponsors, how to monetize your show. But these are all ways that you can beef up your numbers and really showcase, hey, this is how successful my podcast is, and you should be on board as a sponsor. I hope this episode was helpful for you and that you were able to use this information to not only feel like you have a better understanding of your audience, but also that you feel validated as a podcaster. I want to know what you ranked as. What was your global ranking? What are some things that you discovered about your podcast that you had no idea about based on the stuff that we talked about in this episode? Drop it in the comments, send me a DM letting me know. I would love to connect with you as well as cheer you on, because I am your cheerleader. I am here to support you and get you excited about your podcast. Until next time, happy podcasting.